Hello everyone. So our group were curious about how people actually feel when moving through Amsterdam's transport system and how their experiences might affect their decision to cycle. So we came to our main research question, which is how does the subjective experience of Amsterdam's multimodal transport network encourage cycling uptake?
We're in the cycling capital of the world, and cycling is synonymous in Amsterdam. So is cycling to the train station as a part of interchange to other modes of transport. So the problem of looking at a society in mass, which is good at one thing, is that you tend to overlook the experiences of the individual cyclist. And so here we wanted to ask the question through this study of what we would like to change and how we would like to change for more. To do this, we took a look at the stations in Amsterdam, and we noticed how these stations act as nodes of activity which pulse outwards radially. Further, we looked at whether there were intersections between these walkable and cyclable radiuses and tried to look at these intersections and how they could change the character of cycling in Amsterdam. We also considered three major factors for people choosing these specific nodes. And these factors included the multi-transit options and the frequency of connections available at these stations, the quality and availability of bicycling infrastructure at these specific stations, and also in general, the location of each individual station. And so, while considering these, we wanted to categorize our study group into three categories. And the first two were primarily tourists, which are very rarely studied. And so within tourists, we looked at two further categories. One, people who use cycling as a primary mode of transportation, and the second was people who relied more on public transportation. And the third category was our base sample set, which was the locals in Amsterdam, who we studied through interviews, online surveys, and observation during peak hours on working days.
So our study focused on two key locations, which are Amsterdam Central and Amstel Station. Yeah. So Central is Amsterdam's main intermodal hub, offering access to international trains, metro, trams, and buses. It also features large-scale cycling infrastructure. Amstel, on the other hand, is a medium-scale interchange that serves more local, commuter-oriented trips. So we used a small-scale ethnographic method combining field observation with survey responses from station users. So the first questionnaire on the left is for tourists, and the second questionnaire on maybe the size is different, but yes, the second questionnaire is for locals that we interviewed in person at the station. So our assumption before heading into this research was that free and easily accessible bike parking would increase cycling uptakes at this station. And our second assumption was that most people would prefer either to walk or take public transport than to cycle. So as I mentioned before, in our in-person survey at the two stations, we had a total of 13 responses, where 7 were from Central and 6 were from Amstel. On that day, interestingly, 12 out of the 13 participants reported cycling as their primary mode to the station, while only one respondent mentioned that they prefer to walk. We also asked these cyclists about their satisfaction with the bicycle train interchange at the station. The vast majority of 70% said that they were very satisfied, while a small number said that they felt neutral.
Moving on, we also did a survey for the category 1 and 2 respondents, where category 1 are defined as tourists who mainly use cycle to transport around Amsterdam, and category 2 as tourists who use public transport as their main transport mode. So first up, we asked them if this was their first time in Amsterdam, and majority of them answered yes, and we focused more on that. Next, we asked them what was their main choice of stations for traveling around Amsterdam, and most of them also said that they preferred Amsterdam Central as their main transfer station. Next, we also asked them what was their primary mode of travel for their first and last mile connectivity to these stations, and a significant majority, 50%, responded as tram or metro, 30% responded as bike being their mode of connectivity, and another 20%, around 20%, responded as walking as their main transport mode to these stations. Next, moving on to the qualitative questions, we also ask them qualitative questions like their what, how, and where. So first up, we ask them, how would you explain your general experience of interchanging between bike and train? Next, we ask them whether there were any barriers or difficulties they faced when interchanging between these stations, and also what improvements they would suggest to make this bike train transition smoother for them. So in total, we interview around 13 Dutch locals and around 15 tourists in Amsterdam.
All right, so from the pilot study, we interviewed two groups of people. So for the yellow dialogue is for the tourists, and the gray dialogue is for the local. So most of the tourists wanted more signage, bike parkings, so that they can better understand where bikes should be parked. And also some wanted to have a day pass or like a tourist card for them to park in the underground spaces, as they don't have an OV chip card. So onto the locals, most of them wanted sheltered parking spaces and also more parking railings and more parking spaces that are open 24 hours. And when we will interview people in Central, most people mentioned that it would be better if there are more gantries at the entrance and exit due to peak hours. So next up, one quote from the tourists that struck us the most is that as visitors in Amsterdam, they felt that they needed more instruction on the cost, the location, and how long they can park the bicycle.
Based on the 28 responses across interviews, observations, and online forms, so 3 main points came up about what changed that both tourists and locals expected. So among tourists, the first and the most point that was repeated over again was easier and more visible wayfinding at stations. The phrase that I didn't use it because I didn't know it existed or because I didn't know where to find it was one that was thrown around multiple times through multiple interviews. So it is noticeable that more than the infrastructure that exists, the information that the infrastructure exists should be more visible, which also brings us to our second point, which is information visibility. We have certain infrastructure that's already available to tourists, but then a streamlined source of information on where to access them and how to access them would be really helpful. And the third is an alternative day pass for tourists for parking, to access OV feeds and other rental bike services was noticed that people said that they would cycle more if they had access to the same. Looking at the locals, they had 3 major asks, which were also in alignment to what the tourists had said, which was more sheltered bicycle parking in and around stations that were easily accessible, more entries to parking and stations, both through underground parking stations and directly into the station from other modes of transit. And the third was better systems at bicycle infrastructure, especially which we noticed at Amstel stations, calling for a numbering system or a certain system that would allow them to find their bikes much easier.
Some of the responses from tourists and locals. We found 3 conclusions. Firstly, we found that land use and location play a big role as cycling infrastructure. For example, Amstel station with more space and easier navigation was more attractive to cyclists, even though Central Station had better facility on paper. Secondly, visibility and clarity are just as important as availability. People won't use bike parking or overface if they don't know where it is, how it works, or whether it is available. Finally, the success of multimodal cycling depends on the user and the context. So the takeaway is this: even in a cycling-friendly city like Amsterdam, design need to match the user's experience and the surrounding context. Amsterdam provides an ideal context for starting cycling as part of a multimodal journey because the city already have strong cycling infrastructure and habits. But if you have repeated this service in other locations, even within Amsterdam's other station, we might see very different results. The same questionnaire could be used at any other popular station in a city to help identify the key barriers to cycling as part of modal interchange. So in that sense, our project not only reviews something about Amsterdam, but also offer a tool that others can apply and adapt to different urban contexts. Thank you.